Hey class, welcome back. I hope you guys are all doing well today and staying safe and staying healthy. First off today, I just want to remind you, I'm not sure when you're watching this video, but Tuesday of this week, Tuesday, May 5th, by midnight, you have to have your second research paper turned into me via email in Word document form. I have a notice on Moodle about that. I have, obviously, you have the syllabus with the date on it and the notice on Moodle for this week. But I'm just reminding you now in this video that your paper is due May 5th by midnight. Before we get into the PowerPoint lecture today, I just want to share with you what we'll be covering this week. The first is we'll be talking about John F. Kennedy and his impact on the Cold War. Again, we're still covering the Cold War this entire week. It's under the umbrella of the Cold War. We're talking about JFK, Cuban Missile Crisis, and Vietnam. It's all under the Cold War, but we got to talk about some specifics. And so we'll talk about John F. Kennedy and his impact with the Cold War, and we'll talk about his assassination, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is one of the biggest crises of the Cold War, and then we're going to move into Vietnam. Okay, stay tuned for the PowerPoint. Okay, class, we're going to have the PowerPoint lecture now on the Cold War Part 3, and we'll be covering John F. Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The picture on the screen there is actually John F. Kennedy giving a live address to the nation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we'll be talking about his life, his service in World War II, his presidency, his assassination, and the Cuban Missile Crisis today. So John F. Kennedy, born 1917 to 1963, 1963 the time when he was assassinated. Just some background or early life material. His name is John Fitzgerald Kennedy, known as Jack or JFK. And throughout this PowerPoint, I'll probably just be calling him JFK. He was the 35th President of the United States, born May 29, 1917 in Massachusetts, died November 22, 1963 because he was assassinated. His spouse was Jacqueline Kennedy. Her maiden name was Bouvier. Later, she would marry a Greek shipping magnate. That means he was a lot of money and wealth in the shipping industry. His name was Aristotle Onassis. And so her name was changed later to Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Children, John F. Kennedy Jr., he actually died in a plane crash in 1999. And then Carolyn Kennedy was U.S. Ambassador to Japan from 2013 to 2017. John F. Kennedy Jr., I believe he also had some kind of a role with GQ magazine, men's fashion magazine. Brother, Robert F. Kennedy, he was also known as Bobby. He ran for president in 1968, and while he was running for president in 1968, he was actually assassinated also in California by a Palestinian student. His name was Saran. He shot Bobby Kennedy and killed him. So a lot of tragedy follows the Kennedy clan. Continuing with the background, he was born into a wealthy family, a political family. His dad was the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. JFK graduated from Harvard in 1940, and then after Pearl Harbor, JFK joined the U.S. Navy. And so there's a picture there on the right-hand side of the screen of the Kennedy family at Hyannisport, Massachusetts. And so that's in 1931. That's the location of the Kennedy compound, it's called. It's the estate that the Kennedys have there. Even till today, the Kennedy family owns that estate. It's been in the family for a long time. Okay, so he joined the Navy in World War II. So we'll talk about his World War II experience because he actually became kind of famous because of it. He was assigned combat command on PT-109 in the Solomon Islands, which is in the Pacific Ocean. He fought in the Pacific Theater. PT boats were small boats with torpedoes and depth charges that were created to make fast attacks, quick escapes, kind of like a hit and run kind of a tactic. It varied how many sailors were on the boat, but usually it was around 12 to 15 sailors. So they would have the boat would be big enough to have a kitchen and a place to eat, a galley and a eating place, and some beds and all that. But yet it also had torpedoes and depth charges. So it wasn't a huge ship, but it was a smaller kind of boat that could make these hit and run attacks. Usually attacked Japanese supply boats that were running supplies between Japanese-held islands. So these islands that the Japanese had, they usually had they held like a larger island, and these larger islands would then also have small islands all around it, out in the ocean, out further, and they would also have little garrisons on those, and the Japanese would run supplies back and forth from the main island out to the smaller islands, and this Japanese supply line was called the Tokyo Express, and the PT boats were given the task to attack the boats that were giving supplies to the Japanese garrisons on these smaller islands. It was also used for reconnaissance. So here's a picture of the boats. The one on the left is an actual picture of PT-109. And then you see Kennedy, who's in command of this boat, down there on the bottom right. And I just found this schematic. And so you see the boat. I mean, you just imagine a guy standing there. Here's a machine gun, a guy standing back there. Under here would be like the little kitchenette and galley area, maybe a couple of places to sleep. These here would be the torpedo tubes. And there'd be depth charge chutes to let the depth charges go down. And so this would be like a machine gun nest where a guy would sit up in there with the machine gun. Here's another one. Here's where the captain would drive the boat. So it wasn't a huge boat, but it had a lot of armament, very fast and able to make a quick run. On August 2nd, 1943, 15 PT boats were conducting a night raid in complete darkness. PT-109, captained by JFK, was held back in reserve as the other boats moved in for the attack. And as the PT-109 was sitting back in reserves, suddenly out of the darkness, a Japanese destroyer called Amaguri came out of the darkness and slammed into PT-109, and it cut it in half. The Japanese destroyer didn't even realize it hit anything and just kept on going because the destroyer is quite large. 10 of the sailors survived and 2 were killed. JFK was at the helm, and he ended up being thrown to the ground or thrown to the floor of the helm, but he was not injured. There were others that were injured, and 2 were killed. And PT-109 sank, and so the survivors clung to wreckage and then swam to a small deserted island. Here's a picture of the Japanese destroyer Amaguri. So you can see it's quite large compared to that other boat. So they just cut the PT-109 right in half. Okay, so I have a couple of notes here on the bottom. These notes are repeat here. So starting right here where the arrow is going back and forth. JFK and other survivors clung to wreckage and swam to a small deserted island, which was called Plum Pudding Island, and they were rescued 6 days later. JFK received many military decorations because of his bravery, his leadership, rescuing the sailors, all of that. They didn't stay right on Plum Pudding Island. They were there for just a little bit, but because it wasn't very large. Then they went to another island. But 6 days later, they were rescued. So here's a map of PT-109's experience here with the Japanese. So here's the route of the Amaguri coming up through here, and these are part of the Solomon Islands. And the night of August 2nd, 1943, PT-109 is struck by the Amagari, and that just continues on. And it sinks, so they ended up swimming to this island here, which is called Plum Pudding Island, also called Kennedy Island. So on the right here, this is an actual picture from an aircraft of Plum Pudding Island. So it's not very large. I believe it was like 100 yards long. But it had foliage so they could hide, and it was deserted. They ended up going to a different island. They swam to a different island nearby, and then they were able to get rescued. There's actually a movie called PT-109 made back in the 1950s, I think, 50s or 60s. Okay, so after the war, John F. Kennedy gets into politics. He entered politics in 1946 as a Democrat. He served 3 terms in the House of Representatives from 47 to 53, and he was a strong supporter of Cold War policies. He then ran for the U.S. Senate from 1953 to 1960. In 1953, he married Jackie Kennedy. That's how she goes by, Jackie Kennedy. They made a very handsome couple. They were very popular. Jackie Kennedy had this modern fashion sense, and so a lot of what she wore became very popular throughout the United States. Many women wanted to wear the clothing that Jackie Kennedy was wearing. But during this time, JFK did not do a lot in the Senate. He was there for 7 years before he ran for president. He didn't do too much in the Senate. January 1960, he announced his run for the presidency and selected Lyndon Johnson, LBJ. We call him LBJ, so if I refer to LBJ in this PowerPoint, it means Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson. He chose Lyndon Johnson as his vice president. He ran against President Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon. And you might not have known this, but before President Nixon became President Nixon, he was actually the vice president of Eisenhower. And so you have President Eisenhower with Nixon as vice president, and then in the line is then going to be John F. Kennedy, and then when he's killed, Lyndon Johnson becomes president, and then after Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon becomes president. So we're back here in 1960. Richard Nixon, who is the vice president, he is the one that's going to be going against John F. Kennedy. During the presidential campaign, there are 4 televised debates. JFK and Nixon both had a good grasp on the issues. So really, it wasn't the answers they gave in regards to social problems, foreign policy, how to deal with Russia, the Cold War. It wasn't those kind of questions that had the issues. What really hurt Nixon was how he came across on TV. There were 4 televised debates, and JFK, he spoke really well. He was clean cut. He looked very relaxed, and he was a skilled debater. On the other hand, Nixon, who was across the stage, he was kind of stumbling over his answers, kind of fumbling the way he talked. He became very sweaty during the broadcast. You could see sweat all over his face. And one thing that he refused to do is he refused to have makeup put on him to go on TV. And this was black and white television, but the makeup would have helped him out a lot because it would have covered up his facial hair. He was clean shaven, but after a little bit of time during the day, men get it's called a 5 o'clock shadow, where your facial hair starts to grow. Well, when he was on TV with no makeup on, especially black and white TV, it kind of really enhanced his 5 o'clock shadow. He looked kind of shabby. And so this is basically one of the big reasons that these televised debates failed for Nixon. Even though he had a good grasp on the issues, he just didn't look good. It turned out to be a very close vote. John F. Kennedy won the presidency by only 120,000 votes. So that's very close. Okay, so during John F. Kennedy's presidency, which was not very long because he was assassinated, one of the first situations that came into play was the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the Bay of Pigs is a bay in Cuba. On April 17th to the 20th, 1961, the invasion takes place in the Bay of Pigs. And what this was, it was an invasion, it was a failed invasion of Cuba by 1,500 Cuban refugees that had been financed and trained by the United States to topple Fidel Castro. Now, Fidel Castro was the leader of Cuba. He was communist. He was in cahoots with the USSR. And because it's the Cold War and all of that, instead of the United States invading Cuba, the United States financed and trained Cuban refugees. So these are Cubans that left Cuba, came to the United States as refugees. The United States trained them, financed them, and then sent them to invade Cuba and topple Fidel Castro. But because it was a failed invasion, the Cubans fought. There was a battle and all of that. It led to international tensions between the U.S. and the USSR. And after the whole thing kind of pans out, Fidel Castro becomes a hero in Cuba because he basically stood up to the big bad United States, is what they would have said. But the U.S. and the USSR, because of the Cold War going on now for a good number of years, this is just another area of tension, and this is going to lead into a big area of tension, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And we're going to have some slides coming up at the end of this PowerPoint specifically about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Before we get to that, we'll just continue on with JFK's presidency. Another thing that he did was he signed an executive order creating the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps was a humanitarian organization that was financed by the U.S. government that provided social and economic assistance to third world countries. And what it was basically American citizens would go to these third world countries and help these countries. And in the process, what it's doing is it's promoting the United States, and it's promoting peace, and it's promoting democracy. So the requirement was an American citizen with a college degree. You volunteered for a 2-year term, and you would go to this other country and you would work with their government, you would work in their schools, you would work in their communities, doing these different things that would help the society of the third world country. But again, it's all in an attempt to push democracy and push how the United States is caring for the world, and basically it's a push against the USSR, which is being portrayed as no freedoms, kind of like in the dark, backwards, all of that. The next larger event that takes place with JFK's presidency is Vietnam. The Vietnam War did not start when the United States went to Vietnam to fight the Vietnam War. There were many years before the Vietnam War that kind of led up to the beginning of the Vietnam War. And it actually started before JFK. It's just that during JFK's presidency, there was a big concern about communism being influenced, the communist North Vietnam influencing or putting pressure on the democratic South Vietnam. And so we're on the heels of Korea, the Korean War, and that whole issue there. And now it's looking like it's going to go to Vietnam. And so JFK wants to halt the spread of communism, so he was advocating for support of Vietnam. By the time of his assassination in 1963, there were 13,000 U.S. advisors were in Vietnam. And a U.S. advisor was someone in the military, an army personnel that was sent to Vietnam during this time. And what they did was they advised the South Vietnamese army on what to do when they ran into the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong, which we'll talk about this when we get to the Vietnam War. But these advisors that's all they were supposed to do. They were supposed to advise, they were supposed to train, they were supposed to give support, all of that. but they were not supposed to be involved in direct ground combat. And a lot of times they ended up becoming involved in ground combat. But in 1963, there were 13,000 military advisors. Again, these were not the straight-up ground troops, the infantry that you think of with the Vietnam War out fighting in the jungles. These were advisors that would advise. Now, one thing was the military advisors, they would go on missions with the South Vietnamese army as they fought the North Vietnamese army. And so you would have advisors on the battlefield, and sometimes they did get involved in direct combat, but their role was not supposed to be direct combat. But then, notice the last part of that slide, 1963, there was only 13,000 in Vietnam. In 1968, that would reach the height of U.S. personnel in Vietnam at 536,000 in 5 years. So you have a lot of soldiers are going to go to Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But this is just the very, very beginning. Okay, so the assassination, November 21st, 1963, JFK and Jackie flew to Dallas, Texas for a campaign event. At 12:30 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963, while riding in a convertible through Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald shot JFK 2 times. The second shot went in his head. Okay, so he shot 2 times from an upstairs window of the Texas School Book Depository, where Lee Harvey Oswald actually was just hired there recently for a job. The first shot of JFK went in his neck and went out his chest, and the second shot hit him in the head. Is that he was shot in this convertible. Now in Moodle, I have a actual footage of the shooting, frame by frame footage, and it's a little bit graphic. I mean, nothing crazy, but you can see the first shot kind of go in, and JFK kind of slumps, and Jackie is like leaning over, like putting her arm over by him, like something happened. He got shot through the neck and chest, and then just a second later, you see the top of his head kind of pop up, his skull when he got shot in the head. It's a little bit graphic. It's not like gory blood, but you can definitely tell that he was shot in the head in that footage I put on Moodle. Oswald was a 24-year-old former Marine and a USSR sympathizer. And then JFK went to Parkland Memorial Hospital, where he died at age 46. LBJ was sworn in as president on Air Force One, while Jackie stood nearby, still splattered with JFK's blood. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested at 2:15 in the afternoon in the back of a movie theater. And then 2 days later, on November 24th, 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald was shot and killed by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby, at point blank range on live TV. And I also put that footage on Moodle, where the police are bringing Lee Harvey Oswald out of the police station, and Jack Ruby pulls a gun out and shoots him in the gut, and Oswald is rushed to the same hospital where President Kennedy was, and he dies. Okay, so here's a colorized photograph of JFK moments before the assassination. Here's LBJ being sworn in on Air Force One. Now these specks here on Jackie's arm, right there and right there. And there was some more. I'm not sure if it's somewhere here. I think that's where it is there. That's blood from John F. Kennedy. Here's a picture of Lee Harvey Oswald being fatally shot by Jack Ruby. Now, this picture was taken like a nanosecond after the bullet went into him. And like I said, there's footage of this on Moodle. Here's some pictures of the funeral of JFK. So here's Jackie with the black on. This is John F. Kennedy Jr. Here's Caroline Kennedy. This is Bobby Kennedy. He's the one that will be killed in 1968. Here's Kennedy's body. Okay, so here's on the left is Jackie lighting the eternal flame. That's this up here on the right is the eternal flame. It's a torch that is always lit. Jackie died in 1994 and is buried next to John F. Kennedy. So she would be buried here later when she dies. Over here on the right is their graves. And this is the eternal flame. And this is at Arlington National Cemetery. The flame was lit on November 25th, 1963. And since then, it's only gone out 2 times. Besides, when they have to do regular maintenance, they transfer the flame to a temporary torch. When they have to do maintenance on the flame, eternal flame, but then they put it back on. But it did go out 2 times. The first one was during a massive thunderstorm. What happened was the transformer that controls the electric backup, the electric start backup for the flame, that transformer blew during the storm, and it was just heavy downpours, and it put the flame out, and it couldn't restart. And so that was the first time. The second time, some Catholic schoolgirls were sprinkling the eternal flame with holy water out of this bottle, and the top of the bottle came off and dumped on top of the flame and put it out. But because there was it was like a school group, there was a maintenance person nearby for Arlington National Cemetery, and he went over and was able to relight it. But it's been lit for a very, very long time, since November 25th, 1963. And you can go there today and you can see it. Okay, now we're going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis to close out this PowerPoint, October 16th to October 28th, 1962. So this is before John F. Kennedy was killed. He was President of the United States. The Cold War was raging, and the arms race was in full swing. And this is going to lead up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States had 27,000 nuclear missiles deployed at United States sites around the world. After the Second World War, we had a lot of military bases all around the world because of we are a superpower, and we have bases all around the world to ensure peace and promote our national interest and all of that. Well, there were 27,000 nuclear missiles deployed around the world. There were 100 U.S. nuclear missiles in Turkey, and they were aimed at Moscow. Now, compare that to the number for USSR. The USSR had 3,600 nuclear missiles. So the U.S. had a lot more missiles than the USSR. In October 1962, a United States U-2 spy plane secretly photographed USSR nuclear missile sites being built on the island of Cuba, which is only 90 miles from Florida. So if the USSR only has 3,600 nuclear missiles, and the USSR does not have a base right near the United States, like the United States had missiles in Turkey, which is right near USSR, the USSR wanted to get some missiles closer to the United States. So one of these sites was going to be Cuba. And basically, a missile from these sites could hit almost any U.S. city in the United States. So it didn't have to be just Florida. It could have hit Washington, D.C. It could hit New York City. It could hit Dallas. It could hit some major cities in the United States. The blockade. The USSR was sending nuclear arms to Cuba via ship. Of the options considered on October 22, 1963, JFK decided on a blockade of Cuba and gave a televised nationwide speech. Now, the reason this is important is because there's several courses of action you can take. You can do nothing. You can try to end things diplomatically. You can try to You can invade Cuba yourself before the ships get there. I mean, there's different things that you can do. And he decided to do a blockade. But this was a very precarious situation because a blockade, in international law, if a country blockades another country, it can be viewed as an act of war. And so by blockading Cuba, it could have been taken as an act of war on Cuba, and the USSR would have definitely come to Cuba's aid in that situation. So Kennedy, he decides to do the blockade. There were 14 USSR ships. They were on their way to Cuba, accompanied by USSR Navy and submarines. While these ships are coming across the ocean towards Cuba, they're coming across the Atlantic Ocean towards Cuba, the United States sent 23 B-52 nuclear bombers on constant orbital flights around the USSR for quick strikes. So now you have B-52 bombers they actually are holding nuclear bombs in the belly of these bombers, and they're going and doing orbital flights around the USSR. They're not in USSR airspace, but they're ready to strike. I mean, it's very, very precarious. It's like basically going on the verge of nuclear war. Here's a picture of the U.S. Navy planes doing a flyby and photograph of a USSR ship. And you can see on the deck there where the red arrow is pointing are crated nuclear missiles on board this ship, and they're on their way to Cuba. The U.S. blockade and the air presence over Florida, over Cuba, and around the USSR region was so overpowering that the USSR basically kind of changed their mind and pulled their 14 ships, and they basically altered their course. They turned around and they began returning to the Baltic. Most intelligence reports and photos believe the ships contained the nuclear missiles being delivered to Cuba. The USSR was still defiant, and JFK began speaking of a U.S. invasion of Cuba, and this would draw U.S. and the USSR into war. Now here's the situation. This is what kind of helps break the blockade. The U.S. had excellent nuclear positioning, and the USSR did not. The situation was intensified when on the morning of October 27th, Cuba shot down a U.S. U-2 spy plane, and Cuba called on the USSR to nuclear strike the United States. So the ships have turned around, the blockade worked, the ships have turned around, and a U-2 spy plane is taking pictures over Cuba and is shot down by the Cubans. And then after they being shot down by the Cubans are looking at this as like an act of war, and so they call on USSR to nuclear strike the United States. However, in secret negotiations with Khrushchev, that's the leader of the USSR, JFK agreed to remove the nuclear missiles from Turkey if the United States stopped all activity in Cuba. And that's what happened. The USSR agreed, the United States agreed, these secret meetings worked, and of this meeting, the crisis basically ended. Now, the U.S. and the USSR would still have poor relations. The U.S. and Cuba would still have poor relations. The USSR and Cuba, their relations got really strained because Cuba felt betrayed. But the USSR would still support Cuba because it's a communist country. And then in Washington, they installed the Washington-Moscow hotline. And that was a direct phone line installed in the White House for the president to be able to talk with the leader of the USSR directly in case of future issue. And that would be like the red phone in the Oval Office. If that thing rang, or if the president was making a phone call from the red phone, it was because of some kind of a nuclear issue with the USSR. And that's going to be it for the Cold War Part 3. Okay, class, that's going to be it for that PowerPoint lecture. I did want to share with you, there's 2 video clips in Moodle for this session. The first one is actual footage of John F. Kennedy being assassinated. It was taken by a home movie camera, and as the caravan, the limousine pulls by, you can see John F. Kennedy being shot. The first shot kind of goes through his neck and out his chest, and you can kind of see him slump a little bit, and he puts his arm up, and Jackie, who's next to him, leans over towards him. And as she's leaning over towards him, you can see the second shot where his head kind of pops. You can see something fly off the top of his head, and that's because the bullet went into his skull. And then he slumps over, and Jackie climbs onto the back of the limousine. So it's kind of graphic. It's not bloody, gory graphic, but there is a little bit graphic. I mean, he's getting shot in the head. And then there's also a second clip of the actual footage of Lee Harvey Oswald being shot by Jack Ruby. Lee Harvey Oswald is being led out of the police station, and there's a lot of reporters around, and Jack Ruby comes out of the crowd and shoots Oswald in the gut, and he ends up dying. So, and when you hear the gunshot, and then you hear Oswald yell in pain, and they take Oswald back into the police station as they wrestle Jack Ruby to the ground. So it's actual footage of both of these historical events. So you can take a look at those. Other than that, I hope you guys are doing well. I'll see you next time.